you want to lead at the very next level, it's not about more grind or more busyness. It's about a smarter way, which is to manage our energy. So, our guest is Simon Alexander Ong, and he's the best selling author of Energize. Now, Simon has featured on Sky News, in Forbes, and on TEDx. And he is going to share with us how managing our energy is how we can lead with purpose, clarity, and focus. So, this is for you if you want a smarter way to lead at the very next level.
So, on that note, Simon, over to you. Big welcome to you.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
So, let's focus on the business side and kick off with the question: what do you think makes a great, inspiring, and outstanding leader?
Simple answer, Rebecca. What makes for an outstanding leader is the fact that they are a great coach. That is fundamentally what I believe, because if you look at studies conducted by companies like Google, you go back to 2008 and you may have come across the study called Project Oxygen. Now, Google conducted this to understand what made great leaders. And over a year of data collection, quantitative, qualitative analysis, what they discovered that the greatest leaders within their organization were also the best coaches. And so for me, that's what makes a great leader. A leader is not about your title. A leader is about your ability to empower other people, to create an environment that allows others to flourish, to become their own leader. So really, it's about creating more leaders, and we do that by being great coaches. So for me, that's where it begins, Rebecca. And if we sit from that perspective, what we begin to realize is that if we want to lead others, it begins with powerfully leading ourselves first.
So, I think I know what that means, but let's hear it from you. What does leading yourself first mean to you?
Sure. So for me, Rebecca, leading yourself is being aware of who you are. Many of us simply aren't. For me, you can't have self development without self awareness because you can't change what you're not aware of. And that is why true wisdom begins with knowing ourselves. One of the most important activities that I've embraced in my journey as an entrepreneur is that of writing and journaling. It is, if you will, it is the cheapest form of therapy, Rebecca, because it allows us to understand ourselves at a deeper level, to download what is on our mind onto paper so that we have less cluttered minds and space to think clearly, but also to understand what that next step forward is. And in the book, I had the opportunity to interview Diana Chow, who is an incredible lady. She started the world's largest youth for youth not for profit. And she talked about how writing saved her life. And in one of the TED Talks that she delivered, she shared that writing is humanity distilled into ink. Writing is humanity distilled into ink. And that is because as we write, as we journal, we get to understand ourselves more. We get to understand our own humanity, what makes us who we are, and where can we improve as a person so that we can show up as a better version.
So, would one of your tips to leaders, and I think we both appreciate that you could be a leader at any stage of your career, whatever your role is, you can be a leader. It's about stepping into that and seeing yourself as the leader. Would you agree with that, Simon?
Definitely. I mean, when I talk about that leadership begins with us, it's really understanding where we are right now, what we're capable of, what stands in our way, and what must happen for us to improve. And part of the journey in getting to the next level of leadership is really embracing the mindset of an eternal student, to have the humility to know that you don't know it all, to be able to ask for help, to be able to relearn things that may not always serve you today as they may have done in the past. Rebecca, when I went to the United States to speak a couple of years ago, just before I was due to share some thoughts with an audience at Salesforce, I had the opportunity to speak to Simon Sinek, a fellow Simon in the leadership space. And I asked him, what would be one tip you would give to those people who are aspiring to be better leaders in their own life, but also to lead teams within organizations? And he shared 3 words. He said, ask for help, ask for help. And the reason is, if we are to create trusting spaces within the teams that we lead, it begins with us showing vulnerability. Now, showing vulnerability doesn't make you any less of a leader. It simply makes you human. And as a byproduct of that, relatable. And I think this is what teams crave. They want to be able to relate to their leaders. And when leaders can show that vulnerability, that they don't know it all, it also gives permission to all those around them to also ask for help. And that is when we talk about leading by example, that is what it is about. You can't expect those that you lead to demonstrate the qualities you want them to demonstrate if you yourself don't do that.
And I think just by opening that up and showing that level of uncertainty or vulnerability
Hmm.
allows for that psychological safety, which is quite an important phrase that's being discussed at the moment, isn't it? Especially with all the things that are happening around us. Now, one of the points I'd like to ask you about that, how far do you think we have to move between where leadership generally stands today and getting to a place where all leaders are willing and open to share their vulnerabilities with their teams? Where do you think we are on that scale right now?
I think we are in a lot better place than when I first started at work, Rebecca. And just to give an example, I remember being invited last year to speak at a bank. And the group of people that invited me to speak at this particular bank was their well-being committee. Now, I started my career in the world of finance back in the middle of 2007. And when I was starting my career, you would have been laughed at if you had suggested a company having a well-being committee. And so I think the fact that we progressed from that, in which it was all about suck it up, man up, get on with the job, to today, in which we have well-being committees, we have chief people officers. There's some companies that even have chief heart officers. So we're now in a place in which leaders and managers are encouraged to show and develop greater empathy with their fellow colleagues and the people that they are responsible for. So I think we are a lot further along the line than when I first started my career. And I think the world is a much better place for it. Of course, there is a lot more work to do because you hear a lot of challenges for staff who don't have that sort of connection to upper management. I mean, you just got to look at the news and see what P&O did to their staff. I mean, it's atrocious. And when you talk about human capital, I mean, this is complete mismanagement of human capital. And so I think there is still a way to go, but we are in a lot better place, generally speaking, than we were over a decade ago.
Well, it's encouraging to hear that, isn't it? And we can see that shift,
Hmm.
but there is still work to be done. And it's great that people like you are really helping leaders and showing leaders that there is a much better way to lead an organization, to be a leader in your own right.
Definitely. I mean, what I think many leaders forget is that at a very, very basic level, when you design space, when you show people that they are trusted, supported, and appreciated in the space that you create, your business will flourish. Your business will flourish. And I think people underestimate the importance of investment into your human capital. And and when you underestimate that, it's going to come back to bite you, because when you actually involve your staff members, your employees, your colleagues in big decisions to make them feel part of the journey, part of the family, you'll be surprised at how much they want to support you in very challenging circumstances.
And I think it also goes a little bit further than that, perhaps, because they have great ideas. Just
Hmm.
got to encourage them and let them know that no idea is silly, because your amazing idea might be the best thing for the business. But if we don't encourage that, we'll never hear it. And how often have you heard a situation, and I heard of this recently, um, why should I bother? Nobody listens to me. Why should I bother to come up with a new idea? What a waste of talent.
I couldn't agree more, Rebecca. And when we spoke just now about where we are along this journey, I think it's very much a transition from a culture back when I started in the industry in which performance driven culture was the norm. It was exclusively performance driven. You are either right or you're wrong. And if you're wrong, that is a mark against your name when it comes to your performance appraisals. But I think we are slowly progressing or evolving today into consideration of a growth centric culture. Now, it's not about having one or the other, but it's about blending the two. There's a place for performance driven cultures and also a place for growth centric cultures. And we have to blend the two together. Now, what I mean by growth centric culture is that you are not putting pressure on the result, you're putting pressure on the learning. So you are encouraging people to get things wrong, but then challenging them to reflect on what they learn. How are you going to come back with that newfound knowledge in a way that allows you to grow from who you were before you tried that experiment? And so I think when we embrace that growth centric culture, as much as we do the performance side, then that's when we start to unleash the talents within our organizations.
So that sounds fantastic. A growth centric culture. So we have listeners who might say, oh, that sounds interesting, but what specifically do I need to do tomorrow in my business to make that happen, or with my team?
Sure.
How would you recommend they go about doing that?
Well, first of all, if you are in a leadership position, I think the easiest first step goes back to something that Stephen Covey noted in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is seek first to understand and then to be understood. So what does this mean in practice? This means that if you want to unlock the talent potential within your team, you have to start understanding your team as a whole, i.e., each individual has certain preferences, dislikes, strengths, and weaknesses, and different skill sets to one another. But once you start understanding each of them as an individual, that's when you know how you can create the space for each of them to flourish.
And how do you suggest they might go about doing that? You talk about sitting down, having a one-to-one and just getting to know them and ask questions. Is that how you would recommend doing that?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, it's time spent with your team, time spent with your employees. That is how we build that connection. It's like, Rebecca, if you are a parent and you rarely spend time with your child, you don't really understand your child. So you don't know how to speak in their language. You don't know what their likes or their dislikes are. But as you spend more time with them, you understand how to best communicate with them. Some people are visual thinkers. Some people prefer attention to detail. Some people are more emotional than other people. But once we begin to understand how people receive information and how they rate its importance, then we can be much more specific and bespoke in how we deliver that information.
Your book is out and it's on my reading list. What are the key messages in your book? Are they very much what you're talking about here, or are there some other key messages that you'd like to bring out in the podcast?
Sure. I think at a high level, the book is speaking to the fact that we transform the way we live and work by transforming our relationship with our personal energy. Now, if we look at some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, and business owners, what we discover is that they may not be the best necessarily at what they do. They may not be the smartest, they may not be the fastest at what they do, but what they often are the best at is managing their energy, because they know that if you show up each day exhausted and drained of energy, you can't possibly put your best work forward. You can't possibly show people what you're capable of because you don't have the energy to follow through or execute on the things that you know you could do. And so when I talk about energy, Rebecca, I see it from the point of view that there is our physical energy, our mental energy, our emotional energy, and spiritual energy. Now, physical energy is the part that we talk about the most for obvious reasons. We can see it, we can feel it. Get more sleep, eat better, move your body. These are things that we can see has a direct impact on our energy levels. But the things we don't see as obvious are the other three, the mental, emotional, spiritual side. And when we begin to address those areas as much as we can do our physical energy, I think that's when we start to feel more energized when we approach each day at work.
Okay, so we are probably all extremely clear about the physical side, as you said. We know the sleep and we know the exercise and we know having the right nutrition and the right diet. So let's dive a little bit into the others. and share some tips on what our listeners could do to improve the other areas. So let's start with mental energy.
Sure. So mental energy is simply having the capacity to focus. And it is a challenge for many of us. You know, in a world that is increasingly getting noisier and more distracted, slowing down is becoming more of a superpower. So mental energy is simply having the brain power and attention to focus on the things that are most important in the everyday. And I'm sure many of us can relate to that. You know, often we sit down and have a long to-do list, but we just never get around to finishing it. And that is because our best laid plans go awry. You know, we start the day, and before we start attacking that to-do list, we've been distracted by pingings of emails, of notifications. Our mind is in 20 different directions before we've even started on that list. So in order to actually increase our level of mental energy, it's about creating more white space in our calendar to schedule me time as much as you schedule your meetings, your social events, and your holidays. Because when you start scheduling your me time with just as much importance, you give yourself breathing space in the day to focus and to remind yourself of what you wanted to do when you began each day.
Okay. I mean, I understand that completely, and I love the philosophy of deep work, which you may or may not have read the book on deep work.
Cal Newport.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for reminding me of the author's name. So I understand that. The one thing that I would love to dive into a little bit more on what you said is slowing down, because I struggle with that one, and maybe many of our listeners struggle with slowing down. And I read lots about, we've got to slow down a bit. But what does that really mean? Does that mean, in your terms, creating that space where we've got time for reflection and thinking? Is that what you mean?
Definitely. I mean, there's two ways to think about it, and I'll share what I mean here. So imagine if you were an athlete and you were working towards a big event. So you were going to perform in a stadium or in a ring. Now, when you are training towards that event, imagine if you trained physically 9 to 5 every single day without periods of rest. By the time that big event comes around, you are exhausted in every sense of the word. Because there's not been any rest periods built in, you're going into the stadium or to the ring completely emptied out. And it's the same with us. If we don't build in rest periods, if we don't build in moments in which we can take a pit stop, in the same way a racing car has to take a pit stop so they can adjust to its surroundings or the weather or whatever conditions it is faced, we are just going to burn out and collapse. That is exactly what happens. We're going to crash. We're killing our energy. And so that's one way to think about it. The second is, if you reflect on your own life, where have you got your greatest creative breakthroughs? Now, I'm pretty sure it hasn't been sitting in front of a desk looking at your screens all day. Chances are it is when you've been on holiday, when you've had a long hot bath. I mean, look at some of the greatest breakthroughs in history, whether it's Isaac Newton discovering gravity, the apple falling from the tree, Archimedes, displacement theory, lying in a bathtub, Eureka, or Thomas Edison fishing with no bait so nobody, not even the fish, would disturb him. I don't know if these anecdotes are true or not, but I think there is a lot of wisdom in them.
Yeah.
And that is when we deliberately and intentionally slow down, we open up the capacity to not only think different, but to access our creative energy.
I love those points that you make, and they're all very relatable. So I hope that gives ideas out to our listeners about how you might interpret slowing down. And I like the interpretation of making sure you give yourself time out for those new ideas to come in, because when we're busy and hectic, they don't come to the forefront and we're almost pushing them away. What
Definitely.
about spiritual and emotional energy? Please provide us with some insights as to
Sure.
leaders, why that's important and what we can do about it.
So with spiritual energy, Rebecca, it is all about purpose. It is all about purpose. You know, when you are doing something that gives you the opportunity to access your strengths, that is aligned to who you are, then you are going to be full of spiritual energy because it is who you are. This is how you work. This is how you operate. But when you are doing doing something that goes against who you are, that does not give you the space to express your talent or your potential, and it's not what you feel you should be doing, then guess what? There's going to be tension. There's going to be a lot of tension between what you're doing and what you actually want to be doing inside. And it's why when people talk about the fact that the longest journey we humans make are the inches from our heads to our hearts, this is exactly what it is referring to. Because so often we make big life decisions from our head rather than our heart. And while it's not always guaranteed to lead us to where we want to be, it will always lead us, I've discovered, to where we need to be. And so I think if we are to elevate our spiritual energy, it is to understand, why am I doing what I'm doing? What is the purpose for what I'm doing? Because I think when we can tap into purpose within the work that we do, we unlock the greatest sources of energy there is available.
Well, thank you for sharing your perspective on that. Should we tap into emotional, or have we kind of covered that in spiritual?
Yeah, so emotional energy really is about understanding your response to situations. So in our daily lives, when we're going about things in our business or in the companies that we work for, often when an event occurs, we can react emotionally, i.e., we just react and then we regret how we reacted later. And so we're not mindful of our response to an event or to something unexpected that occurred. And so once we begin to master our emotional energy, it is simply to understand what had happened and to process that emotion in a way that is healthy for us so that our response can be a lot better than we want it to be.
So I would interpret that as when we're on purpose, we're in flow and we're very clear.
Mm,
When we react to something in a way that jars us a little bit,
mm.
it's very worthwhile to reflect on that and understand why that has jarred us.
Definitely, definitely. Because I think often we focus on the things, we spend more time focusing on things that we can't control than the things that we can. And I think when we focus on what we can't control, we can get paralyzed by overthinking. We can get paralyzed by all those negative emotions of anger, frustration, sadness. But when we start to focus on what we can, that actually energizes us, Rebecca, because it empowers us to think there is actually small things that I can do that is in my control that will help me navigate out of this positively.
I always think that when you take some action, it feels good, it builds some momentum, and
Mm,
it's far better than sitting and worrying about something or being concerned about something. It always moves us forward, and we feel better. I feel better as a result of it, only for me.
definitely, definitely. I mean, action. I think it's easier said than done. But I think when we take action, however small, that is how clarity and confidence
Yeah.
is born.
Yes, exactly. It might have been on your website where I read this. I'm not sure, but something about um confidence. You're not born with confidence. Confidence comes from taking action.
Mm,
So, and seeing the results of that. Might have been on your
definitely.
website.
Definitely. I mean, from my experience, Rebecca, confidence is never a prerequisite. Confidence comes from taking action. Confidence comes from not the absence of fear, but the belief that you'll be okay despite your fears. And what actually precedes confidence is courage. The courage to take that step, the courage to ask for help, the courage to try something different. And once you've discovered that courage and you've taken the action, however small, that is how you build your bank of confidence. And you add into that bank of confidence and you become more confident. So next time you're faced with that, you feel much more comfortable facing that challenge.
Yeah, I agree with that. I can relate to that, and I've experienced that. So spot on. Thank you for sharing that. Now, as we begin to kind of draw this amazing episode to a close, I'd like to ask you, what have been some of your biggest business challenges and how you have addressed them? So maybe share some tips with our audience where, yeah, they may be in a challenging time right now.
Sure. Rebecca, when you talk about challenges, I think if I look back at the last few years, my greatest challenge has been writing the book that we've mentioned in this conversation, Energize. Now, I understand that writing a book for the first time can be challenging, especially in my case, when the longest thing I've written before this book was a social media caption or a newsletter. And going from that to 65,000 words is, of course, a challenge. But what made this even more of a challenge for myself is that I got the I got the offer in June 2020, and this was just a few weeks after my wife and I became parents for the first time. And we were mentally prepared a few months earlier, so beginning of 2020. We were mentally prepared for her parents. They're based in New York, and my side of the family, who are based in Australia, to come over and help support us in the first few months of being parents. Unfortunately, just before we gave birth, the world went into lockdown. And it meant that everybody who was looking to come to the UK had to cancel their flights. And you couldn't go out. You couldn't go out. Everybody was stuck in their homes. And so imagine the scenario of being a newborn, parent to a newborn. Now you've got to write a 65,000 word book, and your business has to adapt because, well, I do a lot of speaking, Rebecca. So now I can't speak in person at a conference or at a company. I have to adapt my business. I mean, when we talk about business and leadership skills that help in times of uncertainty and challenge, the ability to adapt, I think, is the most important. Because if I was rigid, if I didn't deviate away from just speaking in person, my business wouldn't have survived. I had to adapt. I adapted to speaking virtually over Zoom across some of the many platforms that have since gone live on the market, and also social audio. I started using platforms like Clubhouse. We got LinkedIn Audio now. We've got Facebook Audio, Twitter Spaces. But I had to adapt my form of communication in a world in which everyone could only connect with one another online. So adaptability is the first lesson I took from that. And second, I think, is having an environment around you of people that you can seek support from. I mean, I was going through a lot of challenges personally and professionally. And because I couldn't meet people in person, Rebecca, I had to think of ways that I could access this support. And so I became part of some parents groups. I became part of author groups, fellow people who were writing books. I went into a business mastermind of other business leaders who had to adapt and change things in their world or line of work as well. And I think just having that access to people going through similar things as you makes you realize you're not alone. You're not alone, and there are other people just like you who are also facing very similar challenges. And I think that really helped me to just be able to share what was on my mind, to get it off my chest, and to have people listen to me and offer me a new perspective. So I think that was really useful for me. Was something I learned over the last couple of years there, Rebecca.
Well, well done for adapting to that, and congratulations about your book being out. I wish that all the best. And of course, I don't think you've given credit to yourself, because adaptability requires a certain kind of mindset that says, I have to adapt,
Yeah.
and not put your head in the sand and hope things will go away. So I think, credit to you. You took on the challenge, and that's also a message in itself. Have an open mindset to be adaptable and to change, because the world has changed over the last couple of years. How could our audience best get in touch with you, Simon? Is there anything you'd like to share with them as we draw this to a close?
Sure, Rebecca. Before I wrap up with a final message, you can find me on all the major social platforms, but the two I am most active on is LinkedIn. You can search Simon Alexander Ong and connect with me on the personal profile, because I also have a company page, but you can connect with me on the personal profile, and Instagram. On Instagram, my handle is @SimonAlexanderO. And a message that I would like to close with is that I mentioned earlier about becoming a parent for the first time. And it was a surreal moment, because we were at the hospital. And while I was able to be at the birth of our child, because of the fact we entered lockdown for the very first time, I was only allowed with my wife and child for 1 hour after the birth before all partners had to be ushered out of the building. And that was to manage the number of people within the building so that they could control the spread of COVID. But in the moment that I held my daughter in my arms for the very first time, as you can imagine, I was, of course, flushed with emotion and love. It reminded me of something that I think so many of us forget in the busyness of life. And that is, we are a miracle. The fact that you and I were born to experience this gift of life is an absolute miracle. We have, in effect, won the greatest lottery ticket there is going, the lottery of life. And the question I love to finish on is, what are you going to do with that winning ticket of yours?
Fantastic point to end on. Thank you.
Pleasure, Rebecca.
It is a miracle, and we absolutely should think about what you've just said. So thank you very much for sharing all of that with us today, Simon. Thank you also very much to everyone who listens to the Lead to Succeed podcast, and for your comments and feedback. They really do spur Callum and I on, and we love having amazing guests on our podcast, but we also love having our amazing listeners join us and share their thoughts with us. So thank you all very much for that as well.